So my name is Andrea Lynch. I'm a Principal Associate specialising in construction and engineering risks within our insurance disputes practice here at Milsom Reeve. I'm joined by my colleague Adrian Quintner, who is also a Principal Associate specialising in construction and engineering risks. I'm absolutely delighted to be joined today by our guest speaker, Anthea McDermott, who is a Quantity Surveyor at Currie Brown. Morning both.
Morning.
This session is a follow-up to our webinar that was held in June on the role of a quantity surveyor in a construction project and also the types of claims that they face. In that webinar, we focused mainly on the stage before the building contract and before the works are commenced. Today, we will be focusing on the stage once the works have commenced, specifically today, cost management during the construction stage. So on the screen, hopefully, yes, you can now see our agenda for today. Let's get going with the first item, which is the role of a quantity surveyor, or in short, a QS, as we will refer in the session today. So in the 19th century, the role of a quantity surveyor was once described as taking out in details the measurements and quantities from plans prepared by an architect for the purposes of enabling the builder to calculate the amounts for which they would execute the plans. Now, we can safely say that this role has been significantly widened. Anthea, it might be helpful this morning if you first give us an overview of the role of a QS now on a construction project.
Sure. So a quantity surveyor manages all of the costs of a construction project. During pre-construction, we estimate what these costs will be, and at post-contract stage, we manage the expenditure of those costs. Clients are always seeking cost certainty, so during construction, we advise on forecast spend, the cost of variations, and the risk profile of the project. We also attend site, typically on a monthly basis, to carry out valuations in order to assess the value of works complete.
That's a really interesting overview. Thank you. There's obviously so much that we can focus on, but for today's webinar purposes, we will be focusing on the cost management process themselves, which happened during the construction works. First of all, Anthea, would it be worth mentioning the standard way in which a QS is appointed?
Yeah, so in my experience, the QS has always been engaged by the employer through a tender process or via direct appointment. In some cases, you might be engaged by the architect. However, I would envisage that this may make it more challenging for the QS to combat design changes which have been triggered by the architect. The contractor may also engage their own QS or an in-house QS, but in today's session, I'm talking from the viewpoint of the QS engaged by the employer.
Great, thank you for that. That's really helpful. In our previous Breaking Ground session in June, Adrian, I know that you specifically looked at risks that could arise by not getting the appointment right at the outset. Would it be worth just having a quick summary on that now?
Yeah, so in summary, the appointment is the instrument that defines the relationship between a quantity surveyor and their client. It's important to ensure that all of the services are properly listed to minimize any exposure to allegations around failing to do all that was professionally required of the QS. The QS also needs to ensure the terms are compatible with their professional indemnity insurance. Otherwise, if they can't change the terms, it may be best to turn down the project. Instructions should only be taken directly from those with whom the QS has specifically contracted or from whom the QS has been specifically authorized to deal with by the named client. If you want a bit more detail on these issues, then do check out our previous webinar on our YouTube channel.
Great, thanks, Adrian. Let's move on now to the cost management process itself. Anthea, firstly, it'd be really helpful to understand what exactly is an interim valuation.
Of course, a valuation is a formal contractual process. They're often monthly and are set up to facilitate payments to the contractor for works complete. The contractor's QS will often estimate the value of works complete by way of an application, and my role as the client QS is to validate that application. It's important to note that it is not my role to assess whether the works have been carried out in accordance with the design, because that, of course, is the role of the contract administrator, rather, or the NEC's supervisor. My role is purely to verify the quantum of works complete. Once I've made my assessment, I will draft a valuation certificate and issue it to the project manager or the contract administrator, who will then in turn issue their own payment recommendation certificate to the client.
So at what stage of the project do you usually start receiving the valuations for assessment?
So once construction has commenced, meaning REBA stage 5, interim valuations will commence and continue to happen until PC, which is practical completion. The final certificate will be issued at the end of the defects period in order to release final retention monies, and that is typically 12 months from the date of PC.
And is there a standard procedure when assessing interim valuations, or is it normally just on a case-by-case analysis?
It's a fairly standard procedure. At the start of any contract, we will agree a schedule of valuation dates with the contractor. There are often different valuation timescales depending on which contract is in place. Typically speaking, a contractor will issue us with their payment application for payment before the due date in the contract. All stages of the payment or valuation cycle are determined by this due date. My role is to carry out a valuation and issue my certificate within the 5 days following that due date. And during these 5 days, I will review the contractor's application against the contract pricing documents and the cash flow. The key things I tend to look out for are overclaiming for preliminaries, which are the cost of management, resources, cabins, etc. Applying for the cost of variations, which may not have been agreed yet, or applying for materials off-site which haven't been communicated as being off-site in the first place. There is little time in the valuation cycle, so it is always worth communicating a few weeks in advance that an off-site inspection is required. Once I've carried out my initial review, I will attend the site to carry out a visual inspection of the works being applied for. Once on site, I will assess the quantum of works complete and agree my valuation with the contractor. The approach to valuing work is not only listed in each contract, but it's also really clearly explained in the RICS guidance note, which is called Interim Valuations and Payment, and that's available online through the RICS website.
Great. Thanks, Anthea. So now we've talked about valuations. Can you explain in the same context what exactly a variation is?
Sure. So each contract explains what constitutes a variation under that contract and the respective variation rules. Generally speaking, variations are changes that arise from discovery or client change or scope gap and warrant additional time and cost. The RICS have published a guidance note on this as well. It's called Valuing Change. It's really helpful. And irrespective of the contract, the common theme in valuing change is the QS acting in a fair and reasonable way.
And who typically would trigger a variation?
Well, variations can be triggered by either party in the contract. They can be raised by the employer as a client change in response to emerging client requirements, or they can be raised by the contractor as a discovery item or in response to scope gap, for example.
And at what stage of the project do you usually start receiving variations for assessment?
So contract variations can only happen in REBA stage 5, which is construction stage. It's common for variations to occur at the start of a project when the risk of discovery is at its highest. If sufficient surveys haven't been undertaken pre-contract, this can have a negative bearing post-contract. The cost of post-contract change is also a lot higher than it would be pre-contract because A, the contractor is no longer in competition, and B, they often need to resequence or stand down trades to accommodate that change.
Thank you. Is there a standard procedure when assessing variations, or again, is it just a case-by-case analysis?
Again, this is a fairly standard procedure. During REBA stage 5, it is the role of the contractor's QS to cost variations, and then it's my role to validate that cost. Typically, we start from first principles, i.e. building up a cost using component parts, including labour, materials, equipment, and OH&P. Often the cost of construction activities have already been validated through the tender process, so we can rely on the rates already available to us in the contract for works of a similar character. In instances where work is not of a similar character, then it should be valued at fair rates and prices.
Great, thank you. We've now covered some of the key elements of a QS's role during the works, but Anthea, it might be helpful to hear about challenges that a QS faces when performing the cost management services. It might be worth starting with the valuations.
Of course. So a challenge I've faced a lot recently has been to do with the NEC Option A contract, which is a priced contract with activity schedule. Under this contract, the main contractor can only apply for payment once each activity is 100% complete. If the contractor hasn't carried out a detailed activity schedule, then they cannot be paid until that activity is 100% complete. Some contractors will apply for, let's say, 50% of a door installation because the materials are on site, but the door is yet to be installed. This is prohibited under the contract and can cause many issues. In cases such as these, the contractor has not taken the time to break down their activity schedule into sufficient detail in order to give them the cash flow that they need. Most challenges faced of valuation, in my opinion, are triggered by a lack of understanding of the contract entered into. It's always worth meeting with the contractor's QS prior to the contract commencing to agree expectations for the contract mechanisms.
Thank you. And what about the challenges when assessing variations?
In my experience, contractors can often overestimate the time it takes to carry out a construction activity. Typically speaking, the cost of labour or delay is often the largest component cost of any variation. Agreeing the cost of delays is often the most challenging aspect of agreeing variations, especially under NEC, where time and cost must be agreed together. I was working on an NEC Option A contract recently, which to all intents and purposes is a fixed price lump sum contract. Another challenge regarding variations or compensation events, as they're known under NEC, is that the contractor is entitled to provide a forecast of defined cost, which means that they're estimating a fixed price lump sum to carry out that change, but with an element of risk baked into that estimate. If that risk doesn't materialize, the contractor still gets paid for it. Therefore, agreeing a reasonable level of risk can be time-consuming and can lead to some heated discussions.
I can imagine. Now that we better understand what's involved in the cost management process itself for a QS, Adrian, it might be worth now turning to talk about possible risks that could arise from a negligent cost management during the construction stage.
Yes, well, the QS owes a duty to their client to accurately assess the quantities of work carried out to help ensure interim applications are reasonable. They also have a duty to accurately assess the variations. A low valuation can create financial problems for the contractor, which could lead to the contractor's insolvency, possibly the need for a fresh tender exercise. A high valuation creates a risk to the employer of paying sums for which it obtains no benefit. Both scenarios can give rise to claims against the QS for excess expenditure. Minor errors won't usually amount to negligence. The QS is more likely to be negligent if a simple mathematical error was repeated in a series of valuations, or if the QS makes multiple different errors, or if any individual error has large consequences. The QS may also be liable if they don't flag any defective work they happen to notice that the contract administrator may have missed. But the QS will have some protection because it's the contract administrator's role to approve the quality of the work. It can be difficult for the employer to demonstrate more than nominal loss for a QS's assessment of interim valuations, since if the errors are discovered in time, appropriate adjustments may be made with subsequent interim valuations or the final valuation. The employer will find it easier to demonstrate loss if the contractor has become insolvent in the meantime. An employer can claim excess expenditure on a global basis by comparing the development's actual cost with what it ought to have cost, but the employer must still show that the QS's negligence caused the overspend. For example, in one reported case, the court was satisfied that the QS did not make any attempt to assess certain variations, but that this was not the cause of the loss. The QS's reason for not assessing the variations was to assist the employer's cash flow. The court found that if the QS had explained this to the employer would have gone along with it. This shows how important it is to drill down into causation when faced with a claim.
Yeah, absolutely. Adrian, if you were to sum up, what are some of the key things the QS needs to think about in order to avoid professional negligence claims when assessing interim valuations and variations? What would you say?
Well, obviously no one in any profession, including solicitors, wants a claim made against them. So what I'm about to say is not directed at our guest speaker, of course. And Anthea, please do let me know if you agree or disagree with anything I say. So claims can arise from the QS not staying on top of the paperwork or keeping in touch with the other parties. So the QS should visit the site regularly, discuss with the contractor how their costs compare with the budget, request all relevant documents such as design changes from the employer or architect. They should ensure that the architect keeps them informed about any defective work so they can exclude it from the interim valuations. They should record what is left of the anticipated final contract value after each valuation and ensure this will be adequate to complete the works. They should regularly report to the client on the progress of variation orders, including cost changes, schedule extensions, and quality implications. The QS should also not rush the assessment of valuations or variations. It should be more than a glance around, but equally, the QS needs to work efficiently to submit draft valuation certificates and assessments of variations on time to minimize the impact on project schedules. Finally, quantity surveyors should carefully review project contracts to understand the provisions on valuations and variations. This is crucial for minimizing potential disputes. Anthea, do you agree with all of that or have anything to add?
I would agree with everything you've said there, Adrian. It's also worth probably noting that when we look at variations, fair rates and prices and the term reasonableness are both open to debate and interpretation. And I do know that case law does not provide a definitive position on this.
Absolutely. On that note, Anthea, are there any tips that you would pass on to your fellow quantity surveyors?
Yeah, and broadly speaking, they do echo what Adrian has just said, but I would reiterate, always take time to thoroughly understand the contract you're entering into, and also take time to interrogate the design before construction starts and endeavour to do as many surveys as you can before starting on site, because that will just minimise the risk of raising variations, but also potential claims.
Brilliant. That's excellent. Thank you so much, Anthea and Adrian. That was a really interesting look at what a QS does and of course the risks they face during the cost management process once the works have commenced. We hope you will be able to join us then, and we wish you a good rest of the day.